What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of the propulsion arc in relation to your deadlift movements. So this could be anything like conventional deadlifts, sumo deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, stiff leg deadlifts. What we talk about today is going to be very important in making sure that you're using the right cues for your body type, and that's going to help you produce the most amount of force, lift the most amount of weight, or keep the tension where you want it to be on your deadlift movements while keeping you safe. Okay? What even is the propulsion arc that I speak of? What it is essentially a model created by the physiotherapist Bill Hartman. He is amazing, and if you haven't checked him out already, you really should, especially if you're a coach or an avid lifter. He breaks down a lot of concepts that are super important for your training and have helped me, most importantly with coaching, but in my own lifts as well. Now, for the sake of this video and for bilateral deadlifts, which we'll be talking about, I'm not going to go too in depth with a lot of the terms you see in this diagram. I'm going to be a little bit more specific just to keep things simple and easy to understand for you guys, especially if you haven't heard of this model before. I'm still learning this too, so I'm not going to overstep and try to explain things that even I should get a better grasp on first. So we're going to talk about a few terms that relate specifically to deadlifts in this video. So let's get started. So you'll see here, we got zone 1 here, or the early phase, zone 2, which is the mid phase, and zone 3, which is the late phase. Now, these phases are technically corresponding with gait, which, as we know, is a unilateral motion, technically. And obviously, when you're doing a bilateral deadlift, like a conventional deadlift or a sumo deadlift, it's not unilateral. So, but a lot of these principles still apply to bilateral motions, such as the deadlift. So to break down these zones, when you're deadlifting, zone 3 is where you would be at your lockout. So when you're at the top of the movement, you've completed the deadlift, you're at lockout, you're in what we consider zone 3 or the late phase. And then when you start to hinge down, as you get between 120 degrees and 60 degrees of hip flexion, you enter into what we call zone 2, okay? And then finally in that 60 degrees to 0 degrees of hip flexion, that is your zone 1. If you look here, we have a couple terms on the left: inhalation, expansion, eccentric, external rotation, supination. And you'll see that these are corresponding, or the arrows are pointing to zone 3 and zone 1. So zone 3 and zone 1 are stages or phases that are reliant on strategies such as, again, inhalation, expansion, and external rotation and supination. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus specifically on external rotation and supination, okay? And then when you look at zone 2 has these guys over here: exhalation, compression, internal rotation, and pronation, as well as overcoming action. So these are all corresponding with the zone 2 phase. These are all strategies that are required essentially when you're in zone 2. And so this is where the cues come into play, okay? So based on the lifter, let's say you're conventional deadlifting, right? For most people, when they hinge to the bar, the amount of hip flexion that they're going through in order to get to the bar essentially, or get their hands on the bar, places them in zone 2, okay? So by the time you get to that bar on a conventional deadlift, for most of you, you are in what we call, again, zone 2. Now with zone 2, the strategies or the position that your hips are now in demands these strategies here in order to get you out of this phase, okay? Or to be able to produce force in this phase. If you're in zone 2 and you're conventional deadlifting, you need to be focusing on driving pronation of your feet and some internal rotation of your hips. This is going to drive compression, or these are compressive strategies, and this is going to help you overcome the forces of gravity acting on the bar, and it's going to essentially help you break the bar off the floor. When you are in zone 3, which is again near your lockout, this is where you start to near the lockout, the strategies shift from compressive, so internal rotation, pronation, into more expansive, so they're opening up. This is where you see external rotation and supination of the feet, okay? So if you're someone who is moving into the lockout, or if you're a deadlift specialist, as we like to call it, so your limb proportions are benefiting you in a sense where you don't have to hinge very much to actually get to your starting position. You may well be ending up in zone 3, and so what you need to drive instead is expansion, so external rotation and supination, in order to have an efficient pull. So the strategies change depending on how deep of hip flexion you're in. For this video, we're not going to talk about zone 1 because it's almost impossible to get there on a good deadlift. It's more so something we'll talk about in a squat video, okay? Both internal rotation and external rotation strategies are valid on your deadlifts. It just depends on the lifter's anatomy, their starting position. To say that either internal rotation or external rotation is an incorrect strategy for somebody is just objectively not correct. It all depends on, again, the lifter's anatomy and their setup on the deadlift. So next, let's look at some real life examples. Here's one of my conventional deadlift sets. So for me, my body proportions lend me well to squatting and benching relatively. Deadlifting is definitely not my favorite, but so essentially what that means is for me, as I hinge to this bar, I am very much in a zone 2. And so I need to really focus on driving internal rotation and pronation. Again, these are compressive strategies to help me get the bar moving off the floor. In the past, before I actually learned this model, I have tried to drive more supination and external rotation from this position. And all it did was I'm basically trying to force my body to use strategies that don't line up with the zone or phase that it is in. And so I get punished by having my body compensate mainly through lumbar hyperextension or extension of the lumbar spine, causing low back pain and just not a very strong pull in general. And so over time, if you're someone doing these kinds of things, you're forcing your body to use strategies that don't align well with the zone that it is in. This is where you'll start to see breakdowns and aches and pains down the line. So let's look at the video. Basically what I'm doing, it's hard to see with the feet because of the shoes, but I'm focusing on my inner heel and the ball of my big toe as I drive down. That's, again, cueing pronation of the foot in case you don't know. And then I'm also, as I hinge, I'm driving a little bit of internal rotation just throughout the system. And that's helping me, again, maintain a compressive strategy in order to break the bar off the floor well. Here's another example of this strategy. Now, if you watched our glute training video, you'll remember that this is Paige doing a stiff leg deadlift. Now, a stiff leg deadlift is pretty much as pure of a hinge as you can get. And so for her, she's very much deep in zone 2. And so just like in the prior set we just watched, she needs to focus on driving pronation and internal rotation. So again, that's ball of big toe pressure and inner heel pressure. Most important thing I would say is the pronation, because that's going to help set up to drive internal rotation throughout the entire system. But again, having a little bit of consciousness as you're driving some internal rotation while you hinge can be very useful. This is going to help keep her ribs and pelvis stacked. She's going to be able to produce force efficiently. And most importantly, it's going to limit the amount of compensations that are going on so that she can have a clean lift, and that's going to help keep her safe as she lifts more and more weight, okay? Zone 2, okay? This is your zone 2. So let's talk about zone 3 now. So when you're in zone 3, again, that's pretty much close to the lockout on the deadlift, but zone 3 is the phase that demands an expansive strategy. So again, that's where you're going to drive external rotation and supination. You will most commonly see this in your deadlift specialists, okay? Or even more so in a sumo deadlift. But for your deadlift specialists, their limb proportions lend them very well to essentially not having to hinge so much to get to the bar. And so because they don't go through as much hip flexion, they're able to stay in that zone 3 once they grab the bar. And so from there, they just got to drive those expansive strategies. So they just got to drive external rotation and supination. Here's Ishana on the right. She is our team's deadlift specialist. She competes with sumo, and I think she has one of the most obvious examples of a zone 3 puller. So you can see that if you just look at her hips relatively compared to Paige, there's a lot less hip flexion going on here than there is with Paige. And so for Ishana, she really just needs to get set with her footing. She needs to drive some external rotation. She needs to drive some hard external rotation and supination of her feet. Sumo is advantageous because you can get some relative IR as well. But for her, really, if you just watch this video, she pops off the floor easily. So you'll see here, she's driving that supination, external rotation, and it pops off the ground quite easily. That is, again, these work well for her because her starting position on her deadlifts is basically placing her in a zone 3. And so all she needs to do is drive expansive strategies. So watch one more time as she gets sets up. Watch when she goes for the dynamic wedge. She's going to have that right there. Boom. Supination, external rotation, pops up the floor cleanly, and a nice lockout. Okay? So, like I said before, internal rotation, pronation, external rotation, supination are both valid strategies for deadlifts. It just depends on the anatomy of the lifter and what their starting position looks like. For some people, they may start in a zone 2. For some people, they may start in a zone 3. I've been repeating myself a lot, but I'm just trying to, that's just as simple as it gets. So if you're someone who's been struggling with your deadlifts, you're not unsure which cue is best for you, or let's say you've been using a lot of external rotation, but for whatever reason doesn't feel good for you, this is something to take a look at and see. Maybe you're a zone 2 puller and you need to focus on more internal rotation and pronation, okay? If you have been struggling with all of this really, and you are looking to get some guidance, I've got my Calendly link set up in the description. Feel free to book a call and I'll see what I can do to help you out, okay? But overall, I hope you guys learned something today. The next video I post, we're going to focus on how this propulsion arc relates to squatting, because it's a little more nuanced than the deadlift, but overall the principles remain pretty much the same. So we'll do that next, okay? So thanks for watching and have a great day.